And we are now live.
All right, thank you. This is Senate Appropriations. We're continuing our work on the budget adjustment, and we have Bryn here on the Bryn, you're going to help me with your official title with the Cannabis Control Board.
Yep, got it.
Executive Director.
You're the executive, the ED. Okay, Executive Director.
The only problem is I still get, when I flash up to try to send her something, I still get her legislative email. And I think I've sent a few things to your legislative email.
That happens sometimes, that auto.
Yeah.
So we're happy to have you back in a different capacity and look forward to your hearing your budget adjustment request. And you obviously know everybody on the committee. So welcome, Bryn, and we'll just let you present to us your request and the reasons for it.
Okay, thank you so much. So it's great to be with you, committee. Thank you for inviting me. For the record, Bryn Hare, Executive Director of the Cannabis Control Board. And so I am here to kind of give some context to the board's budget adjustment request. And I submitted to the committee a memo that I drafted that it kind of explains what our request was initially to House Appropriations. And House Appropriations did partially grant our request. And so I'll explain that too. But you should have that memo available on your website. So I thought it might be helpful.
You were requesting 11 positions and they granted, at least for now, 3.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay.
Our full request was 11 positions. They granted us the 3 positions that we requested for licensing staff. And that was really in an effort to, they did not want to rush through the request. And they wanted some time to really analyze what we were asking for. And given our legislative deadlines that I'm happy that I will talk about as I go through kind of the higher points of the memo, I did ask that they at least at a minimum give us those 3 positions for licensing staff, since we are scheduled to open up our first window for receiving license applications in just a few weeks in April. So I thought if we could get those 3 positions onboarded relatively quickly, that would give the legislature some more time to think about the remainder of our request. So that's kind of what happened on the House side. But I thought it might be helpful if I gave the committee a little context and a picture of where the board is at after they were seated. So I'll start with that. So this committee will probably remember well that Act 164 passed in 2020 in October, which was that marathon session year, the first year of COVID. And that was our enabling legislation that created the Cannabis Control Board. Those 3 board members were not seated until the spring of the following year of 2021. So they were seated a few months late. But that initial bill, Act 164, gave the Cannabis Control Board 2 positions, an executive director and an administrative assistant. And the legislature really contemplated that those positions would help the board get underway with its work. And the follow-up legislation that was passed in the following year, Act 62, gave the board 2 more positions, a general counsel and a director of operations. And these 2 positions were granted in contemplation of letting the board get their rulemaking process underway, help transition the medical program to the Cannabis Control Board, which happened just a couple of weeks ago. So those 4 positions were granted to the board really in order to get the board off the ground, not to launch the entire adult use cannabis program. So with this crew of 4 people, we've had an incredibly busy 5 months. Since I was hired in July, we've moved into our headquarters. We've gotten our space up and running. We've had 35 full meetings of the board, 75 meetings of our advisory committee and our associated subcommittees, numerous public comment hearings. All of these meetings have been held pursuant to open meeting law and have been public and had portions of those meetings dedicated to public comment. We've gotten our website up and running and fielded hundreds of public comments through a portal on our website. We've put out 4 legislative reports, 2 proposed fee structures. We've started our procurement process on our licensing portal and our track and trace software. We've drafted and pre-filed all 5 of our administrative rules. We're in the public comment period of our administrative rulemaking process. And as I mentioned, we transitioned the medical cannabis program to the board. And now at this point, we are poised to start accepting those first license applications, which come in 3 months. Yep.
You're talking about medical cannabis to the board. Now, we were talking about, Senator Sears was talking about the need to extend a date. And I just want to, be clear. And so that transfer to the board has occurred, but there needs to be a time extension or something because we've kind of got a gap. And so I was just trying to connect what you said about the medical component going to the board relative to this date that's problematic. And
Yes.
I just want to make sure I'm making the right connection here.
Understood. So the medical program was scheduled to transition from the Department of Public Safety to the Cannabis Control Board on January 1st of this year. But the underlying enabling legislation had some funky timelines. And one of them was that there was a sunset for the existing DPS medical rule and the existing statutory authority over the medical program on March 1st of this year. So that program is continuing to operate under the existing law that is set forth in statute now and the existing rule, but that is going to sunset in March, and we need just a little bit more time to complete our rulemaking process. We have that new medical rule drafted, and as I mentioned, it's been pre-filed and we're in public comment process now. So S-186 contemplated just bumping out that sunset until July.
Okay, and Senator Sears had suggested maybe the most expedient vehicle to do that would be in the budget adjustment.
I would
Because
agree
of the
with
March. That's not that far away, is it? When you think about it.
No, it's not.
No.
It's certainly not.
Okay.
Right around
All
the
right.
corner.
Thank you.
Yes, and so I'm happy to get Chrissy that language, if that would be helpful for the committee to look at. So anyway, back to my sort of rundown of what the board has been up to. We've really obviously had a really quite breakneck 5 months, but once those applications begin to roll in, our work is going to expand really exponentially, and it's also going to look quite different than it has up until now. So I know that this committee is pretty familiar with what the regulations of an adult use cannabis market look like. I know that you spent quite a bit of time with Act 164. I believe that there were 7 pages in that bill that were dedicated just to describing, directing the board with respect to what we should be regulating. So applications are going to include operating plans, financial disclosures, background checks that include like criminal history records and administrative background checks, compliance and enforcement plans, security plans, insurance requirements, banking documents, taxation documentation. This is just like a sample of what will be included on these applications that are scheduled to come in starting in April. And then once we are able to field those applications and we start granting licenses, and there are cannabis establishments out there operating under these licenses that we issue, that's when the board will need to start fielding complaints and conducting compliance checks and investigations. We'll have to enforce all of the regulations that the legislature directed us to create. So that just as a sample, that includes like regulations on employment and training. Every cannabis establishment has employee training requirements, record keeping requirements, health and safety requirements, sanitary requirements, packaging and labeling review that we will have to conduct. We will have to be tracking product as it moves throughout the supply chain in the industry. We'll have to be checking storage and transportation regulation adherence and wastewater thresholds, and we'll have to be conducting soil samples. And this is kind of just a little sample, because I know you guys are well familiar with all of this. But just as a reminder, the board is tasked with handling retail enforcement, food processing facility inspections, extraction facility inspections, testing lab inspections, cultivation site inspections, pesticide action level testing, lab testing of soil samples, and cannabis products for contaminants, potency, and quality assurance. So this is all to say that it was never contemplated that these 4 staff that the board has right now would be sufficient to launch the adult use program in the way that the legislature intended the adult use program to look. So in order to conduct the oversight and enforcement of this industry that the legislature contemplated, we need a minimum of 11 additional staff. And those staff I've outlined in the memo what they are. I've also included a comparison chart of what we are requesting in comparison with other regulatory agencies in other states, to give you a sense of how this is, what we're asking for is really quite in line with what exists in other states. It's actually even a little bit less than the kind of staffing that exists in other states. And one thing I wanted to mention about this comparison chart, it really kind of speaks for itself. I'm happy to dive into it if you'd like, but it's not necessarily an apples to apples comparison when I'm comparing us to other states, because Vermont really created some specific policy objectives in the legislation that could possibly make our regulatory job more intensive. So for example, Vermont has quite a thriving illicit market, as you know, illicit cannabis market. And the board has been directed to move as much of that existing illicit market into the regulated space as possible. And another one of the major goals of the legislation was to prioritize small cultivators in establishing the cannabis market. So Vermont wanted quite a diverse marketplace. They didn't want a handful of big operators coming in and providing enough cannabis to meet the demand of all of Vermont's consumers. You wanted a whole broad swath of people who are participating in the market. So as a result, the way that we've crafted our regulations so far really seeks to encourage smaller growers to seek a license. And in fact, our tiering structure that we've proposed that to the House Ways and Means Committee with our fee proposal is really almost entirely made up of smaller operators. So like a mid-sized tier here in Vermont, which would be about 5,000 to 10,000 square feet of canopy, would be kind of a micro tier in a state like Massachusetts, for example. So the idea here is, and this is your idea, the legislature's idea, was really to ensure that we met our demand with numerous smaller operators. And that would mean that the Cannabis Control Board may be shouldering sort of a greater regulatory burden than a state with a limited number of licensees that would be serving their entire market. So just a reminder, no limit on licenses here in Vermont. Many other states provide limits on the number of licenses, which means that they wind up with a smaller number of operators that serve a greater number of people. So that's like an example of how our staffing needs may actually be greater than the needs of some other state agencies in order to achieve these policy goals that the legislature has set for us. So as I mentioned, yes.
Sorry. Back to the overall number versus what the House has so far gone along with. Is the sense that it's a few now and then the rest in the 23 budget?
That was what was contemplated in House Appropriations, yes.
Okay, and how does that hamstring you, if at all?
So it's my position that I'd like to be totally operationally ready before we receive our first license applications. I would like to have all of our licensing staff and compliance staff in place and trained prior to issuing the first cannabis license, which we are scheduled to do in May of this year. But given, that we've been trying to meet our deadlines as best we can, and given the givens about what this market actually looks like, and making sure that because we're supposed to issue our first retail licenses in October, making sure that we are giving our cultivators enough time to grow product to be available for sale at retail in October. We're not asking for an extension of the deadline. Rather, I'm just trying to get my staff with me and trained as soon as possible. So I'm happy. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Fran, do you need?
I have to, oh, sorry.
Just
Go
a
ahead.
Go
second.
ahead, Phil. finish
Phil,
your-
why don't you continue and then Senator Starr?
All right, just to finish, I think given the traditional skepticisms about cannabis, given the sometimes charged political nature of rolling out a market like this, I think we really run great risks in understaffing at the beginning, in the same way that I was worried that the late appointments were going to wind up producing glitches that people would associate with the product rather than a botched rollout. So the House is going to do what they're going to do, but I personally would favor, if not the 11, then a number of employees that's closer to the ideal, because I just don't think we can afford to get it wrong. And the idea that we might save a little money on their salaries, or I don't know what the thinking is exactly, but it just seems like giving the machine what it needs as it's starting is a way to avoid potential, blowback for any number of things that might then be delayed, whether it's proper inspection or, perceived glitches in licensing that get attributed to bias, or any number of things could go wrong with too few people. So I just want to express a little support right at the front here for getting more employees into the operation.
Okay, and then we would have to obviously spend more time out of the 11 requested. We have 3. Then what would be the position? Which other additional positions? I think maybe part of this is, of course, this is all being funded by advancing general fund, because there's no revenue here to support any of this. So there's been so what we're building is expenditure with a anticipation of repaying once the revenues start coming in, whatever that level of revenues might be. So I don't know if that was part of the thinking, or just a matter of what is the right timeline, against what is that October 1 is really the crucial deadline or date. Is that or sort of what does that timeline look like between now and whatever, when you really become operational?
Right. So there are several windows that are opening over the next several months. So it starts in April, when we are scheduled to receive applications for 3 different types of licenses, including the cultivation licensees. And then we are scheduled to start issuing those licenses in May. And then over the summer, 2 more windows open up, culminating in October, when the first set of retail licenses we are scheduled to issue. So ideally, we would have compliance staff on board and trained by May, when we are issuing those initial cannabis establishment licenses, because we will have work to do in regulating those individuals once they have received a license. So it is sort of unfolding over the summer. The first set of available licenses is the testing labs, the cultivation licenses, and the integrated licenses. And then over the summer are the wholesalers and the manufacturers. And then later in the early fall, the window opens for retailers.
Maybe it would be helpful if we just had that timeline of when, that you just given us verbally, because I would think workforce is influenced by every single one of those pieces of that timeline. So we have Senator Starr and then Senator Westman.
Yeah, I was just wondering, and I support what Phil had to say. but I'm wondering, so we need 8 more positions. And Bren, how soon will the planting be able to start this growing season? And if it does start this growing season, I can see where you're really going to need these people to regulate everything.
You're gonna have a growing season if you're gonna have product October, right?
Well, yeah, but if we dub around and don't have the rules ready and the regs ready and all that until July, or, well, if our budget starts in July, the new budget, you can't get going until August. July and August, you aren't gonna have any growing
Yeah.
season this year.
I guess what would be very helpful, Bryn, is the House has given 3 after hearing testimony. If you could identify for us those critical pieces of work and the staffing you need to support them relative to that timeline to help us say by June 30th, out of those 11, these, not only do we need 3, but we need 3 more. And then we're going to need in the upcoming fiscal year, in that next quarter, we're going to need the remainder. I'm just doing this off the top of my head, but right now we're kind of expressing our concerns around, what is it, a penny foolish or something? What is that saying? And a
Yeah.
pound? What
Penny
is
wise,
that?
pound foolish.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And penny wise. So on the other hand, I know that the House has spent a lot of time because they have more time, but I do want to better understand the modules of work and when they have to be done against sort of back planning from that October 1 date.
So I would be glad to do this. I would be glad to put this like in a chart if that would be helpful. What I'd like to reiterate is that I don't have a way of anticipating how many licensees are going to begin to apply in April. It could be that we have hundreds of cultivation applicants in April and that we are tasked with issuing maybe hundreds of cultivation licenses in May. And they could be geographically dispersed across the state. We're hoping that they will be. So my goal is to have all of these staff on board as soon as possible. And I'm happy to lay out a chart of when if we need to take additional time, when sort of a drop dead date would be. But I guess what I'm trying to say here is that I would like all 11 staff as soon as possible, so we are able to meet these legislative deadlines.
Well, you have 5 full-time compliance officers to conduct investigations. I would think that I don't know, during this first phase, what kind of investigations would you be undertaking? It seems like that's to make sure that there's compliance and that, or follow up on violations. That's what I'm just trying to sort out in terms of what that the different functions or job duties go with the different positions.
Sure. I would be glad to do that and to provide some details about what is in our proposed administrative rules. And just to follow up on one thing Senator Starr said, we do plan on having those administrative rules in place and ready to go by the time our first licenses are issued. So hopefully we won't be waiting on those.
And that would be May.
Right.
No.
Okay.
April, and yeah, so they would be able to plant this spring.
They apply in
Right.
April and then they'd start issuing licenses in May, I think. Is that what you said, Bryn?
Those are the legislative timelines set forth in our enabling set. Yep. Yeah. So
Okay.
I'm happy to talk more about those positions if you'd like, or answer any questions.
Well, I think what we're really trying to evaluate is, and I think Senator Bruce said, are we in our effort to be fiscally responsible, are we in fact perhaps compromising the work, or what would be viewed as increasing the risk that there would be problems or delays in carrying out the work that the legislature has required. So I think if you can help us with that in terms of the 3 are really important, the next group are important, and we would request that you consider, I don't know, you're probably coming back and saying, I want all 11. You wouldn't have done that. I don't think you're going to say, I asked for 11 because I thought that's what we needed. On the other hand, we still have to negotiate with the House in terms of what we end up with. And so it would be very helpful if you could help us better understand the risk and the importance and how those positions give you the resources that are required to carry out the legislative work that we have assigned.
Absolutely. I'm very glad to provide that for the committee. And I hear your point about the number of compliance personnel that we're requesting. I do think that's the appropriate number, but whether those could be broken out into 2 separate allotments, I think is a good point.
Okay.
And I'd be glad to consider that. The 2 other positions that are not licensing staff and compliance staff are also very important. A financial manager to kind of monitor their financial operations over here, which will be a significant amount of work, given that we also are tasked with overseeing the medical program, and also a full-time data analyst to serve the board and also probably help us serve the legislature, since we imagine that there will be plenty of requests for data on industry viability and so forth. So those are the other 2 positions.
Senator Sears, do I hear you?
Yeah, when do the positions from the state, the Department of Public Safety, move to the Cannabis Control Commission?
They did on January 1. They're with us now.
So those are included in that number that we talked about, or are they separate?
They're not part of the 11.
They're not part of the 11. No, they
Oh,
are
okay.
separate, and they're currently operating under their own budget. So those
Okay.
they are separate positions.
So, I hate to, what we could end up doing is delaying the ability to be on their own by 2025 if we delay these positions. Because the quicker we get license fees in, the quicker that we get establishments up and running, the quicker they can be on their own without requiring dollars to advanced dollars. I guess that's the term we use.
That's the trade-off, and that's the hard part to know.
That's what I don't,
yeah.
I mean, I don't know what the House would go along with. If we said 11 and they said 3, you'd come up with 6, but,
Well, that's
it
why I'm
appears-
thinking that it would be
Yeah.
helpful if Bryn, in light of our attempt to try to look at this, could help us understand the need and what are the implications or the risk associated with not
Underfunded.
associated with only 3 positions
Yeah,
as
if-
opposed to 6 or 9 or whatever.
If we
Because
get,
go ahead.
yeah, I agree. If we get people who are trying to apply for licenses and they can't do it in a timely fashion, many of them will drop off or decide that that the system doesn't work. Vermont screwed it up, and I can just imagine the calls from some of my constituents if they can't get somebody to come and approve their license.
Do we need to create these positions, Bryn?
So the way that House Appropriations did it was that they gave us 3 positions that are existing from the position pool. So I don't think you need to, I think you could do it that way.
But are there 11 or how? What I'm just thinking is a lot of times there's a lag between you got to hire, you got to recruit, and and whatever. If you had approval to commence hiring like before the, within this current fiscal year, even though the effective date of employment was July 1st. I'm just wondering if there aren't 11 positions in the pool, we're going to have to create positions, I think. And maybe there's a way of making sure that because it does add a lot of delay when you've got to wait. And if you wait till July 1st to actually start recruiting and hiring, I mean, you're 6 weeks into toward October. So maybe there's a way of recognizing that, in fact, there's a lag and you could start recruiting, for the final segment or something in May for a July 1, start of employment. I'm just doing this off the top of my head. So that may not work, but it's just something that I think could help recognize that even if you have approval or the positions get created, you don't fill them the next day.
Yes, you're having a lot of the same thoughts that I've been having over the last several weeks.
Okay, all right.
So I'm not sure if there are 11 positions in the position pool, but I can certainly find out.
All right. And because if we have to create positions, then the legislature can only do that. So that's why I'm asking, and we'll have to have more discussion. And if we create them and authorize, so that you can get started on the recruitment and get that application process, that usually, if people have got to give notice with current employment and so forth, you're usually that's going to take 4 to 6 weeks. And I'd hate to really wait until July 1st to expect that within that very compressed October timeframe would work very well. So we'll just have to figure out how we can make it support, because I think everybody's of concern. We're going to start it up. We want to do a solid job. We don't want to overload the system, and we don't want to start off on a kind of a negative view from the get-go. It's very hard to ever redeem yourself from that. So we'll check on the positions and exactly what is required. And I think Stephanie's listening. So in terms of, do we actually have to create some positions as well? Alice, yes.
Is there a time frame from which an application is totally complete and you receive it to when you have to say yes or no? Or is that just unlimited?
No, there's what is directed in statute is that we are able to start issuing licenses to cannabis establishments in May, but there is nothing that requires us to do so because we will need to take the time that we need to review those applications and vet them and make sure that it's appropriate for them to have a license.
Okay.
And the product all has to be grown in Vermont. These have to be licensed, and none of these. Okay. All right. Center Star.
Yeah, I was wondering too, Brent, is there any cross labor that from the medical side that you could use on the cannabis side for growers, or are they totally separate?
So there are 3 staff that have been running the medical program, and they have very full plates. Those 3 full-time positions are quite busy with the medical program. So I'm not sure that there's much room there for them to take on additional responsibilities for the adult use side. They are classified positions. So if worse comes to worse, we can go into some overtime situation. We've also contemplated hiring some contractors to help us if we get to that point.
And okay. Senator Westman.
The medical marijuana people are going to continue to do what they've already done, because you go live with the medical marijuana people before everybody else. It would be really helpful if there was a chart. It said, here's the training time, here's that everybody's talked about. Then when we face the house and someone has to negotiate out where we are, we can know exactly what, how to explain this to them.
I'd be glad to do that for this committee. My pleasure.
Other comments or questions? Okay, so I guess we you know what our concerns are. We're trying to balance it out. If you can give us that information would be helpful. Stephanie came on. I don't know about the positions. Is that something, Bryn, that you would follow up, or is that something we would look at in terms of whether if we go with more than 3, do we have to create positions?
You would.
I'm assuming we need to, the pool doesn't have enough to simply take to fund.
I'm pretty sure
5
that's the
more.
case. I can't remember what the House did for the 3. They might have taken them out of the pool, but I think you would probably be creating positions.
Okay, all right. And only we can do that. So that's the other.
Yep, you're it.
Yeah, okay. So we have a little more work to do on that then. Okay. Anything else in terms of information that we would like Bryn to provide us as we try to figure out a response here? Okay.
I'd just say if their problem was they really didn't understand what all of the 11 would be doing, we're going to have to answer that.
Yeah.
Yes, and why that particular function has got to be put in place at a date
Certain.
certain or within this fiscal year as opposed to July 1st, or how do we maximize that lead time so that everybody is trained or everybody's hired and ready to start July, we'll just have to see how that that timeline looks like that Bryn's going to give it.
And I think what you hear, Bryn, is everybody on our committee is ready to move, but we just have to answer their concerns.
I hear you.
Well, I'm not sure we're ready to move on all 11 until we get the additional information. So,
but none of us want to hold this up and make it start off on a bad foot.
No. And whatever resources are necessary and recognizing some things take longer. Okay.
Jane, can we use federal money for this economic development proposal?
I don't think so. This is not legal. Still.
Even hiring staff is illegal.
I don't see that we could get away with that.
Asking for trouble.
Mm-hmm. But what we're doing though is advancing a general fund to support all this work because there's no revenue yet to pay for it. And I don't know what the payback period of time is. I've heard it suggested maybe with our one-time money, we ought to just pay this couple million or whatever it is now and not expect the revenues to. The big question is what will be the revenues by the time we've got them all apportioned?
I don't think anybody knows.
No.
It's so dependent on how much of the black market is, how many people are willing, want to buy and I think one of the questions will be the ski areas and how they can.
Yeah.
Hearing that Ludlow said no is interesting, but if some of the ski areas have a lot of people coming up from Massachusetts, but I still go by in my area. There are now 2 places in Williamstown, Mass, in the North Adams area that sell cannabis retail, and they estimated a while back that around 25% of sales were minors. And though not all of Massachusetts, but just those outlets or whatever they call them.
Well, we'll see. And the other thing we don't want to do in any way is compromise the operation of our medical
No,
cannabis program as well. Okay, other questions? If not, I guess we can, and Stephanie will check out on the positions, and Bryn, you'll give us sort of that timeline. And when it's absolutely imperative to have, certain positions ready to move. And also what is also helpful is just recognizing the lag time between when you get approval and by the time you've got that resource on board. And so if you're holding it until July 1st, you really are pushing right against, that October 1. So I think maybe that visually that can help understand sort of
And
the
also
time compression that you will be experiencing.
language that we need for the delay of from
Yeah,
March 1st.
Yeah. Chrissy will get that and we'll take care of that as well. Okay.
Okay,
I think we're all set, Bryn. Thank you very much. And
Thank you.
all right,
committee,
thank you.
this is our last witness for today. So I'm going to